Today in Crazed Performance Repair, we are going to do a little bit of a performance build on a small block Chevy. This is going to be a fairly high output engine where it's going to be above 1,000 horsepower. So we're going to go ahead and cover some of the details and some of the steps I take in going through one of these specific builds. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you're going to notice right off the bat, I already have the crank sitting in place here. Now, this is kind of an after step. Now, I've already taken a ton of the steps and taken care of a lot of things that I needed to get to this point, and I'm just going to talk about them quick because they're really not that worth, having you guys see anything for. So basically, the steps to get to this point, obviously, the block has to be gone through. This one was bored. It's at a 4.155 bore, which is the largest bore recommended by Dart, because this is a Dart block, to go with for power adding and things like that on one of these engines. Now, this particular build is going to be a 4.155 bore with a 3.875 stroke. Now, why would I choose a 3.875 stroke? Well, we wanted to maximize the displacement on this engine without getting such a huge stroke that we have crankshaft to camshaft clearance issues. If you go with a 4-inch stroke on one of these particular motors and you have really heavy duty rods, which I will go ahead and show you guys in a little bit, but if you have the really heavy duty rods like this one's going to have, then you have to have the rods clearanced for the camshaft, because the cam lobes with a high lift profile like this one's going to be running will become a bit of an issue. So this one is going to have 680 thousandths lift. If you don't know much about motors, don't worry, I'll get into more detail about that later. This one, to this step, or this point, where I am checking clearances on the bearings. Now, the crank is brand new. This is a forged Eagle crank. The block is used, but this is a block I've actually built on a previous build before, and the guy melted the motor because of heat issues. Basically, a piston burned up. But the block was obviously salvageable, and that's why we're using it at a different build now. So the original guy sold it to a different guy, and now I'm building it again, which is kind of cool. But anyway, so the block is ready and good to go. The crank is ready, good to go. It is stock bearing clearances. I did get a little quick polish over the crank, even though it's brand new. No big deal there. A little smear action of oil. I'll be cleaning that off. But the mains here, you can see I have cleaned those. The block is all cleaned. All the plugs are out of the block. I have set a standard clearance bearing in it thus far as the mains go, and I'm currently to the point of where I'm going to check the main bearing clearance. Now, why a standard bearing if it's going to be a high output motor? I'm not going with a standard bearing, but I'm starting with a standard bearing as far as standard clearance goes. The reason I'm doing that is to get a baseline for where the clearance is now, so I can get my target clearance. I have two sets of bearings here today. I have a standard clearance, and then I have a 1/1000th extra clearance bearing. And most likely I'll end up going with the extra clearance bearing, but I want to see where the standard bearing clearance sits first, because every block and every crank machine job is a little bit different, and I have a goal for a specific clearance of 2 to 2.5 thousandths on the main. Now, if this was going to be a 1500 horse all-day motor, this block is not necessarily rated for that, and so I would suspect a little bit of block twist going on at that power level, and because of that, I would clearance the bearings a little bit bigger. I'd be more in the 2.5 to 3 thousandths, and he'd have to run a thicker oil to make up for that, just to make sure that things don't bind and cause issues. So because he is not going to be going above 1500 at all ever, we're just going to go ahead and give it a little tighter tolerances so it's got more longevity in this motor. So right now I have put all the caps on except for this last one, because I'm going to do it with you here. I have already wiped down. I'm using a actual sock, a brand new sock. I'm going to go ahead and set the bearing in here, and then of course any lint that you see, that was a hair on there, you got to get that out of there, and make sure that you use either a lint-free rag or an actual fabric rag like this one. And now you might think these frays are going to cause an issue. They're really not. they don't fall off necessarily. This is just inside out because the other side is a little dirty from wiping down the rest of them. So I've already wiped down the bearing. I use WD-40 because it does kind of evaporate after a little bit, and it acts as a very minor lubricant. It seems to make it easier when you're dealing with Plasti-Gauge, which is what's sitting right here, and what I'm, whoa, don't have the support there, which is what I'm using on this particular engine, and what I use on pretty much all my engines. So I actually measure things beforehand, and then I use the Plasti-Gauge as a secondary, just to make sure. I'm expecting this thing to be around 1.8 thousandths of clearance on these things, and I'm going to verify it by using the Plasti-Gauge. Now, I've gone over great detail in one of my other videos on Plasti-Gauge, but Plasti-Gauge is not as bad as the wrap sheet is for it. The wrap sheet from Plasti-Gauge, for being such a bad thing to use in the engine world, comes from malpractice in using Plasti-Gauge. So, if you do it right, you're careful, and you don't screw things up, I'll talk about something in a second, then you can use Plasti-Gauge, and it is actually a fairly accurate tool to use to measure bearing clearance. Because when you use calipers and different bore gauges and things like that, not only can you scratch the bearings themselves, but you can also get an inaccurate reading if you're not putting it in the right position. And since it's a circle, if you're offset of the circle even a little bit, it can completely screw up your measurement. So that's not necessarily any more accurate than Plasti-Gauge. Now, Plasti-Gauge, if done correctly, you're not going to have any issues because you didn't distort it, you didn't wreck it, anything like that. This particular one, when I was peeling this open, it decided to stick on one side more than the other side, and it actually tore the Plasti-Gauge right here. So this little section right here, this very end piece where it got torn, I will be cutting it off and throwing it away. I will only use the section that pulled off easy when I did the separation process of this paper. You can see how it's like floating inside there, and that's okay. But if at any point it sticks to one side really badly, then I have to be concerned about, it's actually sticking right there. I'm going to go ahead and just try and roll this. Be very cautious not to, that spot's screwed up, so I won't be able to use this end either. Something got crushed in the auto parts store. See how it's stuck right there? So I'm going to be cutting this off and throwing this piece away as well. So you just got to watch out. That's where Plasti-Gauge gets really screwed up on, is in situations like that, and why people screw up when they use it. So I'm going to go ahead, get everything tightened down, and then we'll get you guys right back for checking the clearance. But in the meantime, I'm going to throw away this little bad chunk of Plasti-Gauge. And then a little trick, you can use a razor blade to just touch the Plasti-Gauge to pick it up. It puts a small nick in it, but it doesn't affect how it measures. It actually works really well. So I torqued all the main caps down, and I have studs for this as well, but they're splayed main caps, so I can't leave the studs in there to pull this up. So I'm going to go ahead, and these have nice little, on the dart block, have nice little pry spots for popping the caps up. So I'm going to go ahead and pop all the caps up, and I'm going to have to put a pin in there. And I have to be sure to be careful not to rotate this crank or do anything. I've already made sure that I didn't do any of that while torquing everything down. But I'm going to go ahead and pop all these main caps off quick, and we're going to take a look at what the bearing clearance is sitting at. Okay, so I got the Plasti-Gauge sitting here ready to go. You can see it's right at the 1.5 thou of clearance mark, which is kind of what I was expecting, 1.8, 1.5, something like that. So it's definitely a bit tight. I'm going to go ahead and get the other bearings swapped out here. Now, considering that, if I go a little bit tighter side, if I go a 1/2 thou, so if I do a half of one of the extra clearance bearings, it's going to be a 1/2 thou, which will be 2. If I go this is kind of a bad position to be in, because if I go with the full extra thou clearance on this thing, then it's going to be 2.5, which is on the big end of what I want. I'd probably rather be on the small end. It's kind of I don't know. I think I'm going to go for the small end because it'll wear out after the first couple of starts, and this is of course going to be the tightest area of the bearing. If there's any high spots in the bearing, this is going to show it, or going to show it tighter than it really is. So I think I'm going to go with the tight end just in case these bearings have a little bit of unevenness to them, and just to be safe. Even the one over on this side is showing the same exact thing. Now the very rear one, that one is actually showing a lot looser than the rest of these by 0.3 of a thou probably. So that one I'm definitely only going to do a half bearing. So I'm going to go ahead and grab all the extra thou clearance half bearings for this side of the engine, so just for the caps themselves. I'll give that section the extra half, that way I don't have to pull the crank out. I'll just clean off the plastic gauge and then go ahead and throw the other ones in and put new plastic gauge down just to double check everything. Okay, I got all the bearings set up here and measured, and if I go right here, you can see I'm right at the 2 thousandths mark on that one. This one's a little tighter than 2 thousandths over on one end and closer to 2 on the other end. And now you notice I also put the bearing, or the plastic gauge in a different way. That's just to make sure it's not too uneven. This one's a little uneven, but not horrible. It's a little under 2 thousandths on that one, or over technically, so it would be like 2 or something, give or take. And then this guy here is right pretty much at the 2 thousandths mark. So they're all pretty much right at 2 thousandths, and specifically because of unevenness like this is why I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. It might be a little bit looser in different spots and a little bit tighter in other spots, but I'd rather have it end up, once it wears, to be the correct tolerance, which will be between my 2 and 2.5 thousandths, than have it over 2.5 thousandths where I don't really want it for this particular build. Alright, so I have spent the last hour or two just basically gapping rings, doing ring gapping things. So gapping the rings is a very, very critical step when building a motor. If you don't gap the rings, well, in this case, you wouldn't even get the motor put together because the gap was so tight that it actually contacted, so you wouldn't have been able to even put it in the bore. And that's because this is a performance build, and a lot of times performance rings, when they know you're doing performance stuff, they intentionally design it so it's tight. That way you can set the gap exactly where you want and you don't have to worry about it. So this one, I have all the rings gapped. I actually have the top rings in the cylinders that I gapped them just in case the bores just somehow cause a little bit of a change. I mean, the bores are all identical. They really are. I mean, they're within 1/10 of a thou. But even so, that 1/10 of a thou could make a difference on the ring gap. So I make sure that I keep them in the bore until I get the piston in the bore. Now, a unique thing about the small block Chevy is the fact that it's got the Siamese ports in it. That means the 2 center cylinders here, the exhaust valves, are both on this side. And then considering we have exhaust and intake relief valve spots, we have to make sure that we put the piston in there correctly. So I'm going to have to picture in my head here which way this has to go. But we have to make sure that we have this in the right way. And then we have the one that's over here has to be the opposite. So for instance, it would be like this, right? Oh wait, no, wrong way. Ah, I'm screwing myself up here. What do we got here? We got... There we go. So it would be like that, and then this one would be opposite as well, and then this one would be like that there. So that's how you would line those up. And then the other thing is, on the rod, there's a chamfered side, and then there's a flush side. One side goes against the other rod, like that, when it's on the crank, from the other side. And then the other side, the chamfered side, that has to go towards the crank where it's just going right into the counterweight part of the crank. And that's because the bearings, or the crank itself, has a big chamfer in the crank, and the bearing is offset inside the rod. So when I put these things together, the first thing I do is I have to sit and figure out which pistons go where, and then I have to get my valve reliefs in the right spot and my connecting rod in the right flip direction for the small block to make it work. And that's why I leave the wrist pin, I leave one of the spiral locks. These actually have spiral locks in these pistons. I leave one out until I get that all figured out. So I'm going to go ahead and figure all that out now, and then I will start assembling things. And once I get things a little bit further along, I'll give you guys an update on where I'm sitting and what I have done thus far to get to the point I am. I'm still waiting on a couple of parts for the bottom end here. I have not tightened down all the main caps. I have the main bolts for the front 4 on the mains here. So I have these ones snugged down just to hold the crank into place. This one's completely loose, and then I have, of course, lube in there so I can still go ahead and turn this thing and do what I need to do for getting the piston set up. But I don't have a rear main seal yet, so I haven't put this on. Once I get the rear main seal, then I'll go ahead and torque all these down and get them in. But once I get the rear main, what I have to do is I have to loosen these up and lift this up just a little bit so I can put the rear main in, and I'll show you guys that as soon as I get it. Pistons and rods. We have pistons and rods. Now, these pistons, they require that they have a support ring, which is what this guy is here, and that sits here, and that's just to support the oil ring for this little gap area here. And that's the only purpose of this extra piece here. Be sure to get your rotating assembly balanced as well. I just figure I'd note that. But why did I go with this particular setup? So this motor is being set up to pretty much handle anything that gets thrown at it, but it's only going to be running a lot less horsepower than what this thing can handle. Now, this is just because the guy wants the thing to be super reliable. I don't need to build it stronger to be reliable, but he wants to be able to add boost later if he decides it just doesn't have enough power. So this guy's one of those guys who's thinking for the future and wants to get ahead of the game. And in case he gets bored with it naturally aspirated, he's going to add boost later. So I'm building this motor for boost as far as all the parts and things like that go. So that way later on he can just simply add his boost. He doesn't have to take the motor apart. He doesn't have to do nothing. It's going to work perfectly fine. Maybe change the cam at most. That's about it though. So I am setting this guy up specifically for boost. That's why I went with the boost line rods from Wiseco, because these things are insanely strong. I don't see any way of breaking one of these unless you're doing something very stupid. And then of course we have extremely heavy duty wrist pins in this particular engine build as well. So I increased the wrist pin size. I had custom pistons made that are reinforced. They have thicker skirts. They have some thicker reinforcement here. Now, there's different pistons, different versions, different things that have all different benefits. I was not looking for a specific thing. I just want to make sure it's strong enough and going to be able to seal properly, and that's what Wiseco has done for me per the horsepower rating I gave them. So some pistons will have some bracing that goes like this. Like JE has a very good piston design as far as how they brace things to reduce weight yet increase strength a lot. So JE has a very nice setup. I didn't go with JEs on this one. I do like the Wisecos. I'm kind of partial to Wiseco. Usually they have these lines up here on this top section, and those lines there are really nice for making sure that you keep the cylinder wall clean and undamaged when you get any kind of dirt or debris in there. Say you get a little carbon inside your cylinder for some reason, and you got some carbon buildup and it breaks free. That groove seems to prevent the cylinders from getting scored as much. I don't know, just something that I've noticed. I've taken motors apart that had those grooves versus ones that don't, approximately the same miles, same horsepower, and it seems like the ones with those grooves have less scoring going on the cylinders. I'm not sure why that is. I just assume it has something to do with those grooves, because that's really the only difference that I've ever had when I take those motors apart that I've built. So I have built enough motors now that I have been taking them apart after building them to update, upgrade, change things, and that's kind of the things that I've been noticing as I've been doing this. Now, I'm going to go ahead, finish getting this assembled, and then as you can see below, I'm already well on my way, and we're going to get this thing finished up for the bottom end side of things and go from there, I guess. So before I get a little too far here, I wanted to cover a couple things on the pistons and the assembly process. So as I'm assembling it here, of course I realized a couple of things, and that's why I wanted to address it. The spiral locks for pistons are quite a challenge to install, and if you don't have the proper tool, which I don't, I've never invested in it. Even if I bought it, I probably wouldn't be able to figure out how to use a stupid thing anyway. I'm too old-fashioned, I guess, even though I'm young. I don't know how to explain it. Anyway, so when it comes to installing the things, I kind of found a trick to make it work, and it seems like I have to relearn this trick every time I do these darn things, and I don't realize it till the very last one. That's when I really get good at it. I'm about 4 deep. I'm on the 4th one now, and I'm kind of getting the hang of it. But basically, the trick that makes it work is you want to take and spread the thing out like this on your fingers, and then you go inside the hole here, and you want to go kind of at this angle and rock it in there. And then once you get this part down on the surface there, you take this finger and you push down on this while holding up on the rest of this. It's kind of tricky, but it can be done with your fingers to get the start of it. And then once you get that far, then you can take a screwdriver, preferably with somewhat duller edges. I'm using a little bit of a worn out tip on my screwdriver so it's not so sharp, it doesn't gouge the aluminum when I touch the aluminum by accident. But you want to try and concentrate on the clip, and you push down on it and try and roll it in. When you're trying to roll it in, it is going to attempt to push against here. So as you're trying to push this part down here, it's going to be pushing the clip that way. So the top part that's not locked in place yet, that's on there, that is going to be pushing against this piece. So you need to make sure you pull up on that every so often as you're doing it, and then it'll slide right in. If for any reason you're pushing really hard, you're going to end up damaging and wrecking this little spiral lock, and that's obviously not a good thing to do. So be sure to be cautious when doing it, and just be patient. You'll get the hang of it. It takes a little time, but it can be done with the fingers and a little screwdriver. I'm using kind of a smaller screwdriver, not a really small one. I usually used to use a very small, like a pocket screwdriver. And I don't know, they're both a horse apiece. As long as you can get in there is the big thing and just kind of push down on it, because your fingernail is not strong enough without destroying your fingers. And that's kind of the way I found out to try and help from killing your fingers, but no matter what you do, your fingers are going to hurt when you're done. These things are definitely a challenge to put in, but there's no way they're ever going to come out. I will be touching on the other style of clip for those on a different engine build, and I'll be sure when that one's available to go ahead and link that above as well. When it comes down to the piston rings, especially on this specific type of engine where you have the wrist pin going where the cutout is for the oil ring passage of it, be sure to install these correctly. Now you can see I have not finished installing this, and I am rocking it around, and people will think that's a huge no-no, don't do that. This isn't the piston ring. It's not going to break. This is actually spring steel. This is just the retaining ring for the oil control ring. And when you put these things on, you need to make absolutely certain that you get this little dot down towards the wrist pin or towards the rod, and have that dot lined up in one of the gaps here, either this side or this side, when you do it. And then when you're putting this guy on here, the last step, the reason I left it in this position was to cover the last step of rolling it on there. So I'm kind of rocking it around, and you'll be able to feel the metal fatiguing. If you pay attention to how you're feeling it, you can feel when you're at the stretch limit of the metal, if you ever reach that, because it'll kind of get a little bit stiff right before you're at the stretch, the flex to yield point where it'll be permanently bent. You don't want to reach that point. If you feel any more resistance than the maximum resistance, I have no way to really explain it other than that. You'll kind of have to get the feel for it. But if you feel that, don't go any further. Figure out what's binding, what's causing the issue. But once you get to this point, we're at the last little section here, you don't want to just push it down. You could, but it's going to leave a huge scratch here. You want to grab this guy, pull out on it, so that you give a little bit of a gap, and then as you rock it down, it should leave no scratch on here. And that's the same for the rings. The same thing goes for the rings as well. And then, of course, I'm just taking my fingernail, pushing down on this to push down on that clip and get it down on the bottom, and then I'll go ahead and put the oil ring on. When it comes to the oil ring, of course, you got to put this guy on first. So that's just simply push it like that, and it falls practically into place. And then since you have this little control ring down on the bottom here, you do have to kind of push it down with the oil ring a little bit. Just kind of lightly push, and then if you have the oil ring overlapping like that, you can't have that. You obviously got to get that to match flush with that. And then the trick I found to keep that flush is push that down first before you actually apply this part of the oil ring. And then remember where that gap is. So you can see where the gap is right here. You need to keep tabs of that gap, because you don't want to line this gap up with that gap. I found that it works best to go off counter it just a little bit and then apply the ring down on the bottom section first. So you want to get it started on the bottom and then go like this, and you can roll. These rings are the only ones you can roll, if you be very gentle with them, around it like that, and it'll go very easily. If there's any binding whatsoever, obviously there's an issue. Then when you do the second or technically third ring for the oil ring, I make sure that the gap here ends up opposite of the gap of the other one. So I will go ahead and throw it over here and then do the same darn thing, real lightly push, and it goes fairly easily, and then once it snaps into place, you're good to go. And then I just go ahead and position the rings where I like them. I have a specific position that I like. You might be different or partial to a specific position that you think works better. I have my own little positioning, and I do that at the very last second. Then finally, the second ring and the top ring, when applying those guys on, of course you need to make sure top and bottom are correct. Now a Napier ring, the cutaway section on the edge of the ring that I showed you in that picture, it has to go down, and so what I like to do is put these two ends on the slot that it's going in, and then I pry them apart, and the ring will fall down into place. And then that's how I kind of get that into position. The top ring is a much stiffer ring, but same thing applies. I go ahead and I pry apart on this part. Now I'm going to have to do this down below on the ground, because if I do it right here, I might drop the piston. I need to be able to rest this thing on my lap. I don't feel comfortable doing the top ring because it requires so much more pressure. But I do the same thing. I pry it apart, push down on the back until it flops into place, and I'm good. That way I know I didn't stretch it too far, because as soon as this guy flops over, it's at the perfect stretch amount. Now you could get the pliers for it, but I feel like if you do the pliers wrong, you could overwork the rings and stretch them out and screw them up. And if they stretch out, they'll get a weird wave to them and they won't seal properly. So I prefer to do them by hand myself, but that's my own personal opinion. Now, these are the rings that you don't want to do where you rock it around like that. You could if you're very careful, but I recommend not doing that, especially since this ring is very hard to hold the tension back, and it will scratch the side of the piston. Not that that scratch is really going to affect anything, but it's best not to do it that way. Alright, we're going to cut it here on this episode. This has been going on long enough. Now, on the next episode here, you can see I have quite a bit already assembled, so be sure to hit the subscribe button so you can also hit the notification bell and be notified of the next episode when it comes out, so we can complete the rest of this engine build. You can see I'm definitely farther along on this little outro of the video than where I left off on the video you just watched. So, like, share, subscribe, and as always, hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.